Hello, everyone. Is this on? Hello. Hi. Welcome to our event. We'd like to thank the Federalist Society and the Communications Law Practice Group for hosting this event with a wonderful panel and the Honorable Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Brendan Carr has been at the Federal Communications Commission since 2017.
Yeah, 19. Some days it feels that way, but yeah.
He previously worked as the General Counsel at the FCC, as lead advisor to Commissioner Pai. He also worked as an attorney at Wiley Ryan and served as a law clerk for Judge Shedd of the Fourth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. He was an undergraduate at Georgetown, so you're very much a local, and graduated magna cum laude with his JD from the Catholic University of America. So thank you for coming, and I will be asking you questions related to the 2018 quadrennial review of media ownerships.
Great.
I'm going to move here. So I'm going to make you really do all the hard work.
Sure.
By just asking you the questions and then having you tell us the background. So firstly, so the context we're talking about right now, the FCC is considering their quadrennial review of media ownership. This is probably a fairly educated audience in terms of these things, but what are the key current rules, especially as they're related to radio, and what was the original reasoning behind the imposition of these rules?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, first of all, for the Federalist Society for hosting this event. Great to see so many people interested in the work of the FCC, and in particular some of our media ownership rules. As you indicate, I've been in this job for about 2 years now, and I've tried to spend as much time in that 2 years outside of D.C. as possible, not because I don't like my family, but because I think you learn a lot more on the road oftentimes than you do sitting in D.C. and having the layers of lawyers and lobbyists filter information up to you. And on media ownership and media regulation in general, it's interesting. My policy background had been on the wireless side at the FCC, in addition to being general counsel, where you deal with every issue before the agency. My deepest policy background was on wireless issues. It's a bit of a surprise when you come to media regulation issues from a wireless background. I think the FCC's rules in the media space are really the most outdated set of regulations that we have. And the Commission has had a very difficult time, at least up until the last couple of years, modernizing those rules. And in large function, the FCC's media regulations were adopted, many of them in the 1950s, the 1960s, and they assumed a media marketplace where consumers got their information at two ways and at 2 points in time in the day. The first was in the morning when your local newspaper clunked on your front doorstep and you picked it up. And then once at night when you tuned into 3 local broadcast television stations. And so the FCC had a lot of heavy-handed rules in place designed to regulate and manage what we would call scarcity. Very few voices, very few means of getting information. And over the years, it's been a challenge for the FCC to update those regulations. And so for me, when I look across the media landscape, it's about how do we deregulate to create a more level playing field with the reality of today's modern media marketplace. If you're a radio station today, you aren't just competing with other radio stations, you're competing with Spotify, Pandora, Google, Facebook, streaming services, cable. There's a tremendous amount of competition for eyeballs and eardrums in the media landscape today, but yet so many of our FCC rules either expressly or implicitly assume that radio and TV aren't competing with any of those providers, and they were written in an era when those don't exist. So I think my overarching vision for FCC media rules is we have to have the courage to update it based on the current media landscape, which is courage that the FCC for years has not shown.
One of the key factors, or the mandate actually, with the quadrennial review is that the FCC be concerned with issues of localism, diversity, and competition. Do you think that the past media ownership rules have actually succeeded in increasing diversity, localism, or competition?
I think you've seen a lot of mixed results from the FCC's actions before. Right now in this quadrennial, as we call it, every 4 years, the FCC is mandated to take a look at all of our media ownership rules. It's a good move by Congress to make sure that we are taking a fresh look and updating it, but the FCC hasn't taken advantage of that fresh look to do a whole lot for many, many years. Right now, one issue that I'm focused on in our current review is the rules relating to radio ownership. So if you think about it, the market that radio owners compete in today, by and large, is defined, I think, by the local advertising market. And that's a space right now that radio is increasingly competing in with internet providers. If you look at some of the trend lines about what's happening with local ad revenue, I think it tells a very interesting story. So right now in any given market, more than half of local ad revenue, and this is local doctors, car dealerships, furniture stores, the lifeblood of the revenue for radio stations, more than half of it now has shifted in the last 5 years or so to online platforms, and that's by and large Google and Facebook. And I'm not here in any way to bash their move into local ad revenues. I think that's good for them. It's to point up that there's a lack of parity there when it comes to the regulatory structure. So at a point in time when you have more than 50% of local ad revenue going to Google, Facebook, and other online providers, typical radio station is getting 1% of that local ad revenue. So they're trying to compete in this space, and these online platforms, rightfully so, grew up in a largely unregulated environment, and now you're competing with radio stations that essentially have one, if not two hands tied behind their back. We have rules, for instance, that limit the number of stations that a radio company can own in a given market, and that makes it really hard for them to compete in that space of local ad dollars. And then we see that the impact of that is in terms of local news, local content, because that's what TV and radio does so well that a lot of online platforms struggle with. So while they're competing in that same market for ad dollars, they're providing a different local source of information, and radio is doing so, really with their hands tied behind their back.
Right. So this brings up the question of broadcasters have always been defined separately with separate rules and restrictions, and does that still make sense given the amount of competition and the evolving nature of the media marketplace and even the increasing overlap across different types of media and communications?
I think the shift you've seen in competition, particularly from online platforms, undermines a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the rules. So I'll give you an example. Recently, I was on the road in Montana and Wyoming and had the chance to visit some local radio stations. And the first local radio station we visited, which I think we have a video of, that we walked through, you could see a lot of on-air talent, a lot of investment in local news gathering. There's morning show producers. I think this particular one is in Cody, Wyoming. These are people that not only have their own morning show on the station, but they're at the local grocery store, they're at the post office, they're meeting, they're mingling, they're interacting with the local community and hearing from them about what's important to them. And so we have rules at the FCC that are designed to promote that, to promote localism. And the way we do it, though, has backward results. And I'll give you the other side of that story. On that same trip, we went to another local broadcast station, which you can see here, with very different results. It's very, very suspenseful.
I hope they didn't videotape when you broke the window.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. We're from the FCC, there to help. So I'll give you an example of what happened here. Again, we have these regulations on radio that are designed to promote localism. They're designed to promote people that are part of their community. And we do that, again, by having restrictions on owning stations. And so in this one small town or this broader community that we're in, we have one station that's investing in local news gathering, has on-air talent, tries to cover, the local high school football team, is doing everything you generally want a local station to do. And you have this other station that no fault of its own, just through the economics of serving small communities. What they basically have is a Dell laptop inside that station when it's open and when you can get in it, and it's playing music that's piped in from somewhere else on a loop. And we have these regulations that say this company that is investing in local news coverage can't purchase that station to expand its local news gathering because we want localism. And it's a very clear example, I think, of how we have backward-looking regulation. Again, trying to promote localism, we have a situation in which a Dell laptop is pumping in music on a loop. So I think that's a pretty stark example of where we need to sort of update and modernize our approach to give broadcasters a more of a fighting chance in this landscape.
Right. I mean, essentially, the rules are ignoring economies of scale in the very costly gathering of local information.
Yeah.
And so when you're forcing the local stations to have so few stations, they're not able to justify as much of their costs.
Yeah, I mean, you look, there's one station owner, I think, in a similar type of area. The last couple of years, just in local ad dollars coming from car dealerships, which was a big source of their revenue to cover the expenses of local news gathering, they lost $150,000 each year that had been coming to them from car dealerships, that those car dealerships moved to online platforms, whether it's Google or Facebook. So again, this movement of ad dollars away. And again, they're not able to get the scope and the scale to compete with online providers that are not subject to these ownership restrictions that can cover 100% of the country. So I think we need to look at ways to at least take one hand out from behind the back of some of these radio stations.
What did you take away from the recent DOJ workshop looking at substitutability of advertising across platforms?
I think one thing that was interesting is you had a variety of providers on there. I think whether it was cable providers, I think representatives from edge companies, radio stations, I think they all tended to agree that broadcasters, radio broadcasters are competing in the same market for local ad dollars. I think that's an area where we have to continue to move. I don't think we should have an approach, whether it's at the FCC or the DOJ, although I'm not an antitrust expert, that should be defining the market in a way that says radio and TV aren't competing for local ad dollars just in the same way that Google and Facebook are. So I think we need to update our thinking to the extent that we're not recognizing that economic reality.
So I recently heard about the FCC incubator program. What is that?
Yeah, this is an approach that we're doing to try to promote even more diversity in radio ownership that can look at some regulatory relief for stations that agree to what we call incubate, which is to bring on less experienced broadcasters and help them get a foothold in the market and then grow on their own. And we're hopeful that that's one step that can help promote greater diversity in media ownership.
But the key there is that they be in the same markets?
Yeah.
What do you think about any policy options to help promote more localism and local news?
Yeah, we have some good options on the table right now in our quadrennial, including, we have what we call these subcaps, radio subcaps, which is essentially what we've been talking around. And in a nutshell, the way it works is we have a limit that says one owner can't own more than 8 stations, for instance, in a particular market, 5 of which can be FM or AM, and only 3 can be of the other band. And we're looking at some proposals that would relax those rules slightly so that you can get the scale and scope you need to compete. And I think one cautionary tale that I'm cognizant of as we consider these regulations really is the newspaper industry. So for many, many years, starting in 1975, the FCC prohibited TV or radio broadcasters from investing in or owning the local newspaper. And the theory was that there was a concern that there would be a monopoly of the means of distributing information. And perhaps that made sense in 1975, but many, many years ago, particularly with the advent of the internet, it completely undermined, I think, the basis for that concern. Yet up until 2017, the FCC maintained that prohibition. And what happened in the newspaper industry during the period of time which we were, through federal law, prohibiting investment in newspapers, we saw a precipitous decline. There's some stat that I just saw that said that 1,400 towns lost a newspaper over the last few years, including periods of time in which that prohibition was in place. Ad revenue for newspapers declined approaching 70% during some of the same period. And again, the dynamic you saw there, I think, is the same dynamic that you're seeing on the radio side. And the question is, are we going to step in at the FCC soon enough to make a difference? Precipitous decline in newspapers, shuttering, in the ability to invest in local news and journalism, in part, many factors, but in part, the rise of the internet and FCC rules that prevented additional investment. Now, if we'd gone back earlier and allowed investment from TV and radio stations into newspapers, would that have stemmed entirely the tide that we're seeing in terms of the trend in newspapers? I don't know that you can make that case, but the rules we had in place certainly didn't help as you saw the precipitous decline in not just newspapers, but also local news gatherings. So I view that as a cautionary tale for the FCC on the radio side. We don't want to see local radio go the way of some of the struggles we've seen from local newspapers, and that's why I think we need to move now to update some of our approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that struck me, so I was at the FCC in 2006 when we had our quadrennial review, and I oversaw the 10 studies that were done. So I have a little PTSD when I talk about this. But what I found astonishing, and we had pulled together more data for the entire United States, not sampling in the entire media industry for the U.S. for a 5-year period, pulled together some studies that repeatedly found evidence of economies of scope of cross-ownership between newspaper and TV, newspaper and radio, and found economies of scale for like sister TV stations or sister radio stations in the same market. And these were done by 10 different economists from different political viewpoints, and I have to say a lot of the work on the data was done by our internal FCC, our best FCC economists, so they did an amazing job. And yet, all of this was published, part of the record, and everyone said, great. No one ever mentioned these studies. Didn't seem to really come up the following quadrennial review. I just last night looked through.
This was not when I was on the commission.
No. This is when I was there. So.
Okay, good.
But I looked at the 2010 studies. Most of them are just finding non-results in terms of, is there an impact of ownership structure on localism, diversity, and viewpoint? So what I don't understand as an economist is why 10 years, 15 years later, after there have been empirical studies, very detailed empirical studies, this was not more part of the record or part of even the discussion. I almost felt that the FCC should have made a better job, or let me ask it as a question.
No, you're doing great. You're doing great.
And I can ask this because you were not a commissioner then.
Yeah.
Why
was Brian the chief of staff of the agency at the time, though?
No. Why does the FCC not make better use of documented, published, peer review, academic-style research that would help them when it goes to the Court of Appeals? Because the Court of Appeals keeps saying the same thing, that we don't believe this and this, but we have a lot of evidence. It was never put in the final order. You're not responsible, but why do you think that is?
Well, I'll give you two answers. One is, under the current leadership of the FCC, we stood up newly an Office of Economics, and that also looks at data analytics. And I think that idea is to bring economics back into the FCC, and by creating an office that's a standalone office from the other bureaus where the FCC does work, the idea there is you have some independence for the economists, some independent standing for the economists, so that their voices can be louder and can be heard, and they're not sort of going along with the the policy directives of the operating bureau. So I think that decision by the chairman to stand up and bring economics a louder voice hopefully will address a lot of those concerns that we've heard over the years. The other point that I'll make is just a general point, which is applies outside of this context, certainly. Regulations are far easier to impose than they are to modernize and update and revise. And I think when you step back to the highest perspective of this particular issue of radio rules, I mean, to me, it's consistent with much broader principles, which is, on the one side, you've got this massively disruptive force of the internet, which grew up, thrived, and was invented in a free market, largely unregulated regime, and it was able to grow beyond our wildest dreams. On the other hand, you've got radio regulations, TV regulations that came up in a central planning, 1950s, 1960s mindset of regulating scarcity, and it is struggling in part because those regulations are keeping their hands tied behind their back, and they are having difficulty competing with this internet competitor that is operating in a largely free market world. So I think that's the broader dynamic that's at stake here.
Now, let me ask you one question that, the NAB has put forward a proposal to relax the ownership, the limits on radio station ownership within the same market, but they are arguing for larger urban centers, for those rules to be removed. Some have argued, or some might argue, that in more rural settings, where there might not be as much broadband deployment, the story might look different, and there might be some justification for maintaining these rules if one were to assume these rules were useful. Okay, so my little caveat. But
Yeah.
Do you think that this issue of the digital divide comes into play at all when considering these media ownership rules?
Yeah, particularly for Monty, who's vigorously taking notes for the trade press, I haven't made a final decision in this yet, but here's where I'm leaning, which is similar to some of the ideas that you talked about. I think particularly in the smallest markets, we have to be doing everything we can to incentivize investment in local news gathering, in local radio. And so I think it makes sense to provide a lot of regulatory relief in those markets. I think when you talk about bigger cities, I think we still need to take some steps to deregulate there, but I think maintaining some limits there could make sense based at least on some of the factual record that we're seeing developed. I'm open-minded, but that general approach of relaxing ownership rules on the radio side in terms of radio subcaps for smaller markets, given the dynamics that they're facing economically, makes sense, and also relaxing perhaps to a lesser degree in some of the bigger markets. Also questions if people want.
Yeah, are there any questions that you would like to ask Commissioner Carr?
And one thing I can add to this, I was thinking about was this, on the drive over here was this Reagan quote about if it moves, tax it, if it keeps moving, regulate it, if it stops moving, subsidize it. And you can see that play out, I think, in this space. Some of the same groups that were advocating against allowing TV and radio to invest in newspapers and saw now the decline in local news gathering as a result, are coming out with proposals that we should tax Google and Facebook and then have the government take that tax revenue and subsidize local news gathering. So it is a entire regulatory big government approach where if we can deregulate, if we can allow the private sector to invest more, that's a far preferable path in my mindset than keeping the regulatory shackles on local radio and then having to step in down the road with some sort of subsidy approach when our regulations stop them from moving.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure if that analogy will work, but we'll see. We'll see how it comes out in the trade press.
Yes, please.
Hi, Monty Taylor, Com Daily. Is the proposal that you just said you're leaning towards where the larger the city markets get less relaxed rules, is that distinct from the NAB proposal where the top markets still have some limits on FM and the lower markets don't?
Well, since I haven't made a final decision, I can't endorse any particular proposal at this point in time, but the dynamics of what was put forward in the NAB proposal in terms of looking at large markets getting some regulatory relief and more relief in some of the smaller markets is consistent with where I'm leaning right now. Thank you. Is that vague enough to not get me in
And
trouble?
I apologize, I had switched that when I was talking about the NAB. I flipped it.
Why shouldn't it be the role of the federal government to regulate media ownership at all?
Yeah, I like it. First principles question. So you're right. As an original matter, it is right to question. Again, we have competitors in a marketplace, whether it's Google and Facebook. They can reach 100% of the U.S. population. Why do we have rules on the book that limit, TV stations to X percent and radio stations to X percent? I think that's a question that is sort of fully worthy of discussion. From my perspective, at the FCC, part of that is constrained through statutes that Congress has passed that direct us to either achieve particular public policy goals, or at least according to some people's readings, specifically enshrine in federal law caps on how many eyeballs certain owners can reach. But that is a very important question that I think we all need to be asking, that I won't be answering.
Nick Rotz, Hogan Lovells. Given the localism focus, is there any thought on reinstituting Class D LPFM licenses that haven't been issued since 1978?
I thought this was going to be a robocall question from Hogan Lovells, but thankfully it's not. Glad to get a non-robocall question. We're looking at a wide range of issues, and we're happy to look at that as well. And if radio regulation is not your thing, you can feel free to ask about anything else as well.
Yeah.
Now, if your objective is to promote local ownership and local service by radio stations, then why doesn't the commission take into account where the owner comes from? Is there any concern when that owner controls 2/3 or 3/4 of the market, and why don't you let low-power FMs sell commercials so they can be viable?
Yeah, these are good ideas. One of the points is you have, again, these rules that say this one station, has to stay standalone, even if it's just a Dell laptop with a stick broadcasting out music, even if its owner is located in Chicago or Washington, states away from it. So we have these rules designed to, in theory, promote localism that, for this reason and other reasons, are really having the opposite effect in local communities.
I think we could take one last question.
With this effort to promote localism and diversity, I assume that radio is going to die soon, or sometime.
We have some radio owners here, so you might,
But assuming if it did, and everything was on the internet, does the FCC, how would it promote that interest in diversity and localism if everything's on the internet?
Yeah. So I think, again, when you look at the parallel to newspapers and you look at the decline that we've seen, 1,400 communities losing newspapers over the last few years, a big part of that, not all of it, there's some macro trends happening, but was the FCC stopping investment in those stations that could have made a difference, at least in some cases. And that's what I think we need to try to avoid on the radio side, is instead of accepting that radio just can't compete with Google and Facebook and Spotify, why don't we try a deregulatory approach and say, okay, let's allow more investment on the radio side. Let them at least take one hand out from behind their back, and let's see what they can do. They've got a track record, of being live and local, of offering something that's difficult for a nationwide internet platform to replicate. And so my instinct is, let's see where through deregulation we can let them compete in something more approaching a level playing field.
I think I'll repeat your question to Jeffrey when he's up here later. Well, thank you, Commissioner Carr. That was great.
Thanks. That's great. I appreciate it.
Yes, please. All right, so since I'm already sitting here, I'm going to continue as your host of this event. I am very happy to be moderating this panel. We have many distinguished speakers. I'll do a very quick introduction of the three of them, let them speak a little bit to the reason why we're here and what we should be thinking about, and we'll then ask, blurt in and ask hopefully relevant questions. Immediately to my left is Gordon Borrell. He is the CEO of Borrell Associates, which is primarily a media consulting firm. His work has been quoted frequently in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Ad Age, and Forbes. He's appeared on CNN and various TV networks. He originally started as a reporter and editor for the Virginia Pilot in Virginia. And in that time period, he then worked on conceptualizing and creating Infinet, which is an internet access and hosting company that later split up and sold to Earthlink and to Gannett. He then also worked as a vice president for the new media for Landmark Communications. He is currently an executive board member of the local media association and is past president of the Newspaper Association of America's New Media Federation. Francella Ochillo is vice president of the National Policy and General Counsel of the National Hispanic Media Coalition. She has a BS in marketing from Morgan State University and a JD from John Marshall Law School in Chicago. She works primarily to help the discussion in regulatory circles to discuss anything that relates to digital divides, diversity and minority presences, viewpoint diversity. She's worked on filings with the net neutrality arguments, lifeline considerations, and media considerations at the FCC. Jeffrey Warshaw is the founder and CEO of Connoisseur, or you want to say, how do you say
Connoisseur.
it? Connoisseur Media. You should let me take over marketing. All right. He's been a lifelong broadcaster. He started his first station while he was still a student at the Wharton School of Business. And then in 1997, he founded the Connoisseur Communications Partners, which was a 39-station group. He later sold that to Cumulus Broadcasting. He formed now Connoisseur Media, which operates 31 radio station brands and digital assets in 8 markets. Jeff is also on the board of directors of the National Association of Broadcasters, the Radio Advisory Bureau, and a member of the Nielsen Advisory Board. All right. So with that, and I never introduced myself. My name is Michelle Connolly. I'm very famous. I am a professor at Duke University. I am an economist. I worked at 2 different stints at the Federal Communications Commissions as their chief economist, which is why I have at least a little bit of knowledge on some of these issues. And before I get the panel started, I did want to reiterate something that I kind of teed up when I was speaking with Commissioner Carr, and that is that when I have studied and looked at the media ownership rules, the goal is always stated to increase diversity, localism, and competition. But what we observe is they have failed to do this. If the goal of these rules was to achieve a certain outcome, they have utterly failed. And in fact, they've not only not succeeded, but in many cases they've actually created the exact opposite effect from their intended one. So I think that that's a very important point to make, that the same policy levers keep being pulled despite the fact that the outcomes are not changing and are not going in the direction that we want to, and there is no sense of using evidence-based research to really disprove this notion that somehow limiting ownership is going to achieve all these social goods. So, with that said, I will pass the mic to Gordon.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here. I think a lot of what Commissioner Carr said was spot on. My job is to track the lifeblood, I think you used that word, of local media, which is advertising. We tend to focus on audiences and content and news, and that's really important, but 60% to 70% of revenues for newspapers and for television stations comes from advertising. So these advertisers fund these media entities. For radio, it's 70 to 90%, most cases 90%, of their revenues. Their operating revenues for programming, for sales reps, for disc jockeys, et cetera, comes from advertisers. So what I tell these local media companies, and they are in much more crisis than I think anybody in this room really realizes. We see it every day. Some of them are dying. Half of the newspapers in this country don't make money. They lose money. There have been about 40% of the weekly newspapers in this country that have died. These are county newspapers, basically. We're down to about 6,000 of them. We used to have about 10. About 150 daily newspapers have died, and there are about to be more. We're on the precipice of seeing quite a few media companies die. And that's the first wave. That's print, because they come with an inherent cost that broadcast media doesn't have, and that's the cost of the product that has to be physically delivered. Radio is right behind. Jeff will tell you radio is a very strong medium, and it is. It's a very, very popular medium, but it is also a medium that is in trouble as well. There are over 11,000 FM and AM licenses in this country. 11,000. That's about 56 for every television market. 56 radio stations for every TV market. Can't really support that. And then there are 8 commercial television stations for every market. And by the way, there are also Yellow Pages books. So I guess when I look at this whole universe of advertising, which is where I live, in that local advertising part, the job of these businesses are to help these media companies is to help local businesses, local entrepreneurs sell things. And they're under this great duress from companies like Google or Facebook or now Amazon. And it's come in 3 waves, and I'll just end with this. We've seen the share of local advertising for local media companies go from 100% traditional media companies down to 47%. 47% is the share of local advertising that they're getting. The rest goes to Google, Facebook, and a myriad of other out-of-market, we call them, pure play companies. It's getting harder and harder for these local media entities to help marketers in their local communities sell stuff, to provide a voice for them, to provide copy, to provide something that works for them. And that's put these media companies in a lot of trouble. First wave was Google. That brought the share of local media advertising, local media's ownership of advertising down to about 70%. The second wave was Facebook. They were up to about $38 billion last year in US advertising. And that brought the share down to about 50%. The third wave has just hit us, and it's Amazon. They did about $3 billion last year in advertising. Not very many people noticed. And forecasters on Wall Street are now saying Amazon will be up to about $38 billion within 2.5 years. And that's the third wave, and it's going to hit local media companies pretty hard. So I'm glad we're having this discussion. I agree with a lot of your comments, and the young man who got up and said, why do we need to regulate media at all anymore? It makes no sense, and you said it doesn't seem to be helping media. So that's my piece.
Francella, do you want to tell us your viewpoint on this and how you see the history of these developments?
Sure. So my name is Francella, and this is my first time getting to talk about this at the Press Club, and I'm really excited about just getting to be the minority voice. The truth is that a lot of people aren't going to agree necessarily with my positions, but I want to start by bringing up, following up on a question that came up, and also giving a little bit of the background on why these rules are essential. One of the questions that was asked in the Q&A was why the government's regulating this market at all. And I think that it's important to start by thinking about a statistic that was just mentioned. So of the 11,000 radio stations that are in the country, how many of them are owned by women or minority owners? And I think that even by generous estimates, if we're at less than 20%, we have to ask very serious questions about why. And the truth is that the FCC, for decades, systematically excluded women and minorities from being able to get licenses. The FCC intentionally injected itself into that process. So the thing is, you can't let the agency that has actually been complicit in excluding people from getting licenses for decades, when years now, in 2019, it doesn't reflect the population, when we don't say, what are we doing about this? And why that doesn't give us pause. Now, there are a couple of things that I totally agree with. I think that the market is changing rapidly. I think that it's important to make sure that radio broadcasters are able to have revenue and to be able to be robust entities in their communities, because the truth is, if they can't afford to stay open, if they do have a Dell laptop running their entity, then we have a real problem. But the truth is, why is a laptop running that station? What have we done to empower people who maybe don't look like most owners? What have we done to empower them with giving them the capital or the experience or just the levers of power that they need to actually run those stations? And so I think that it's important, one of the things that Michelle brought up, I agree that when we think about the bedrock principles that are included in any policymaking on, the market, we're always thinking about, does it improve competition? Does it improve, the diversity of voices? Are we bringing in new viewpoints? These are bedrock principles that we can't really set aside or water down. But at the time that we do the quadrennial review, it's not just a time to say, do we need to get rid of rules? I think that it's a time for us to evaluate, do the current rules serve the public interest? So that might be an opportunity to say, yeah, maybe we need to think about redefining what's qualified as a radio broadcaster. Maybe we need to think about, how do we support small and mid-sized stations being able to get a little bit more, to be more competitive in their advertising revenue. I totally agree with that. But what concerns me is that we can't make believe that traditional radio stations, or even TV stations for that matter, are equivalent to or substitutes for online providers. Because the truth is that when you're using the public airwaves, the exchange for that was that there's a public interest requirement, and that you actually have an obligation to serve the community in which you're licensed. So I think that some of this isn't necessarily about deregulating. I think some of it is, if we aren't achieving the goals that we've set out in terms of improving the diversity of voices, improving localism, supporting competition, then what do we need to do to address those in particular problems? And thinking about ways that, when we're deregulating, asking really hard questions about who will that benefit. Because what does concern me as an advocate is, I don't have a knee-jerk reaction against all consolidation is bad. That's not what I have a knee-jerk reaction against. What concerns me is that I know that cross-ownership amplifies power. And if you are part of that bottom rung and you have no leverage, when you consolidate or at least enter into an agreement with another company, you do not go in there on equal footing. It is not the same. And so the truth is that those smaller, maybe minority and women-owned businesses are essentially subsumed rather than partners in those contracts. And so what are we doing to support those voices? So I think through this conversation, I'm glad to have it. I'm glad to be healthy opposition, but I want us to all really think carefully about, is it that we're just asking to eliminate certain rules, or is it that we should be saying, we're not meeting our goals here, so yes, we should change these rules, but that needs to be accompanied by other changes.
So if you don't mind, I'll ask a follow-up question. So in line with that, what do you think of the FCC incubator program? Do you think it has a good chance of succeeding or not? And if, depending on that, do you see, what alternatives do you see to try and promote these goals?
I'll say this about the incubator program, because I actually just got off the phone with NEB yesterday. I have a great relationship with them. I talk to them all the time, even though we agree on nothing on filings, all the time. And so I appreciate a good faith effort. I appreciate good ideas. What I would like to see is a more robust effort, whether it's asking, can we do some sort of, whether it's getting like when I heard the statistic that you had started in college, like maybe we reach out to college students and ask them for ideas on how we get more people into the broadcasting industry. How about we tap into other sources to come up with ideas to bring in a more diverse set of ownership? Because I just don't think it's enough for us to rely on the incubator program being the only answer. I don't think that it's adequate, but I appreciate the effort.
Jeff, I'm under a mandate to first ask you how you got here today.
I was meant to fly out of LaGuardia. My flight was canceled or postponed, so I ended up jumping in a cab and going to Penn Station and got here just in time. So I'm happy to be here. I'm honored to be
I heard a
guest
scooter was
here.
involved.
All the different Uber vehicles were involved. So a few things. I really appreciate everybody's comments. First off, the idea that radio doesn't compete with digital is ridiculous. In every possible way we compete with digital. We compete with all the other media. Advertisers view digital as often interchangeable with radio. Our listeners and the people who consume media freely go between digital and traditional media. The idea that somehow we are one world unto ourselves is just ridiculous, and it doesn't hold any water. And there's no way that regulations should embrace that absolutely archaic notion that radio is its own universe. So, I mean, that is absolutely, for somebody who has been doing this since I was a kid, and I'm not a kid any longer, and I've been doing business in, all the glamour markets in America, Flint and Youngstown and Quad Cities, Waterloo, Evansville, Rapid City, Bismarck, Billings, Montana, Erie, PA. So I have and that's just maybe half the markets that I've operated in. So I have a fairly good smattering of what's going on in rural and smaller town America. The idea that our advertisers aren't departing our products is it's just not the truth. And so no matter what happens, to ignore that is to do a tremendous disservice. We are the local medium in most of our markets. When there's a shooting, we own stations in Connecticut. When the Sandy Hook shooting takes place, radio is the entity, is the medium that's there to provide the local service. In fact, CNN came into our studios while we were taking phone calls, and that was their coverage of Sandy Hook. And when politicians need to be heard, radio provides that opportunity. And when there's local news, radio provides that opportunity. And there would be a tremendous loss if local radio disappeared. And we are just not competing on a level playing field. We're not looking for any help. We're not looking for special kudos for doing a great job, which we do as an industry. All we want is a fair fight. And Google and Facebook, not only are they unregulated, but they have a completely different set of rules. Spotify, these are companies that don't have to make money. Apple sells devices. That's what they have Apple Music for. Google is selling your data. Amazon is selling your data. That's how they make money. They never have to make money servicing their local communities and going to their local advertisers. And so that's for them to be unregulated while we are hamstrung is really, at the end of the day, the public will suffer. And I am absolutely sympathetic to the minority ownership. In fact, my thesis at Wharton was opportunities for entrepreneurial minorities in broadcasting. And I actually sold the station I built to a minority-controlled entity. So I've seen some of the rules work, but right now, forgetting being a minority, forgetting being a white man, there is no equity capital for new investment in radio. The public radio companies are decimated. It's virtually impossible to raise money of equity capital. And so from my perspective, if you want the money to come to the minorities minorities and women so they can buy stations, have it be a stronger industry. Because right now, it doesn't matter who you are, you're having a very, very difficult time raising capital. And in the markets that we do business, if we could own more stations, we would very often be buying out a national competitor who has cut down on local service. We would be able to provide more diverse formats. We would be able to provide more local service, more live and local coverage, more news, more public affairs. And it doesn't matter where you live to be local. What matters is that you have a commitment to the local markets that you're doing business. So I'm not sure, it's hard, more work to run local operations. It's more work to retain and train new salespeople. It's getting harder and harder as we compete with digital media. But the idea that somehow this is a gift to local broadcasters, this is what radio needs to remain local and to be able to provide a service in our communities. We need to be given a level playing field.
I wouldn't say it's a gift, it's removing the foot from your jugular. But I have no opinion. All right. How much do you think you're hampered, Jeff, by the fact that radio started out as a broadcasting entity and is, I assume, still primarily a broadcasting entity, but you are making inroads into digital as well? No?
Well, first off, we stream all of our radio stations, but the fact is that every listener that we have that leaves our terrestrial listening to go to digital costs us money. Because of the rules, we cannot make money on streaming. That's the music line, because of the fees that we pay Sound Exchange. So it's not and the same thing goes for Alexa. If you want to have Alexa so they know every single conversation you've ever had, it's your choice. You stream our radio stations. We don't make money from that. It's wonderful that we have listeners and we're able to, it can be the new clock radio in everybody's home. But the fact is that nothing replaces the terrestrial signal. And like on my way to the airport, I stuck my phone in and I got Apple CarPlay, and I could not find a radio dial. And for the idea that radio isn't competing with that, it defies any logic.
Gordon, maybe I could ask you a little bit more about the market for advertising, and do advertisers see digital advertising as being different from advertising over broadcast?
It's interesting. We run the largest survey of local advertisers in the country. It's currently running, and I asked them this year to put in a question about John Wanamaker's lament. If you recall, that was John Wanamaker, a retailer 100 years ago, said half of my advertising works, half of it doesn't. Trouble is, I don't know which half is which. So I asked, let's put that in, and let's ask local advertisers how they feel. It used to be they agreed with it, 100%. They just couldn't figure it out. Now 40% don't agree with it, and it's growing. We tested it a couple of times since we launched the survey. So what's happening with local advertisers is now their perception is that they have more data that comes with this digital media. In the past, they would get reports from radio stations or from television stations or from newspapers that said, look how big our readership is, look how big our audience is, these are the people you're reaching. And they didn't quite believe it. They just didn't know whether it really worked. They knew some of it worked and some of it didn't. Now they have data in the form of clicks, in the form of likes, page views, et cetera, and the reality is half of that advertising works and half of it doesn't. A lot of those clicks come from robots or from China, from other countries. So their perception is, now that they have data, that it works. I will say this, and this is just startling when you get down to it, these local advertisers are pretty smart. We asked them, this is a year ago, you said you bought newspaper advertising, rated on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. You said you bought radio advertising, rated on a scale. You said you bought search advertising, Facebook advertising, et cetera. So we took all the traditional forms of media, radio, TV, newspapers, broadcast and print, cable, outdoor, et cetera, averaged it out, so we got an effectiveness rating for traditional. And we took all the digital forms, search advertising, social media, email advertising, banner ads, et cetera, and we averaged it out. They were exactly the same. They felt that they're both. So what we've found is that recently advertisers and this is in the past six months, and it's changed pretty quickly, advertisers are now buying a package. So they will buy radio advertising with digital, because most of radio sellers now are also selling some forms of digital advertising in the form of banner ads, or maybe they even will do some search engine marketing for the advertiser. Maybe they'll help them with their website. Same thing with newspaper companies, TV, radio. The traditional media industry generated $10.5 billion last year from digital advertising. So they're driving some of that $67 billion in digital advertising that was sold last year, small amount. But in the end, what the advertiser sees, again, is they're on par. They're just getting traditional media with digital media. I'm going to say something that's going to make Jeff really happy in a moment. They're on par, and they want to buy it as a package, and they really need the help of local media companies to help them figure it out, because what do they get when they call Facebook? What do they get when they call Google to help them figure out why this, $10 per click isn't working for them? So the thing that Jeff, you're going to be happy with is that there's one medium that drives digital traffic and digital results better than any other, and it's radio. Radio just does a hell of a job, and advertisers are beginning to see that. That hope is there, and again, my concern is that as these companies see lower and lower margins, as it's harder and harder to raise capital because of all the issues that are happening with audiences, et cetera, there's not going to be enough time. There's not going to be enough time to support the companies that are out there that support their local communities.
So then this segues back to the original question that I wanted to ask Jeff again about the announced purported death of radio. How do you feel about that statement? Do you think it's true?
Yeah.
What do you think will be the saving grace?
Radio has still the greatest reach of any medium by far. It has, gets tremendous results. It's the most trusted medium. It's, certainly far from dead at this point. But an ounce of prevention, it's right now. If we are kind of liberated to allow people to own entities, and keeping in mind that a lot of the radio stations are owned by big public companies. It's not just like individuals. So that does skew the statistics a little bit. But radio is strong right now. It's certainly not as strong as it used to be. It has a smaller local share. And it's kind of a vicious circle, right? Because the harder it gets, the less resources we have. The less resources we have, our product suffers. We have to sell more commercials in order to pay the bills. We become less competitive to the streamers who don't have to do anything to make money because they don't care about making money. And that's the reality. We are competing with a bunch of companies that their model does not require them to make money doing what we do. Yet we're the ones that have the local service that we are number one, that we're charged to do, and number two, that we have to do in order to justify people listening to us. So radio is far from dead. It's certainly much harder than it used to be. And it will continue to get much harder unless and maybe even if we get the relief from these burdensome rules that we're talking about. But it's certainly not dead, and I pray for the country that it doesn't die, because if radio were to go away, it would be a tremendous loss to these local communities. And I don't see any Facebooks or Google or Amazon stepping up and putting people in the street to find out what's really going on in the communities and providing local service and doing fundraising for people who need in those communities who need money, and a voice for the voiceless. I just don't see that happening, and it's and so it would be a tremendous loss. Again, I don't think the industry's asking for a handout. And just as a point of information, I'm on the ownership committee of the National Association of Broadcasters, which was referenced, and there was minority and female representation on that committee, and who supported the NAB proposal. So I actually don't, I think the NAB proposal didn't go far enough. I think that the idea that radio should have any ownership rules is archaic, but again, it's not necessarily politically feasible to have all the rules go away.
There's some questions.
Jackson. I want to address the question that, or the issue that Francella raised with minority ownership with women and minorities. Under the Reagan administration, the FCC instituted a grandfather clause, a regulation, whereby a major network like NBC could not own a radio station and a TV station in the same market. So, NBC here in Washington was forced to sell this radio station, WKYS. And when they did, a minority ownership came forward. And that regulation opened up the doors for minority ownership in the 1980s. Kathy Hughes, she was the owner of WOL here, AM Band, and she proposed to buy WKYS. Well, she didn't get a chance to do that at that time. It was a conglomerate of lawyers and actors. They all came in to buy it. About 4 years later, KOS was sold, and she bought it. Kathy Hughes bought it. 1980s. Today, and she's a female, today she owns 54 radio stations in 16 markets. And she owns 6 stations here in DC, which is a major market. I believe it's number 8. I'm not sure. But somewhere around the top 10. And she also owns 4 Baltimore stations, which is the 20th market. So minority ownership has zoomed under the Reagan administration's regulations on the grandfather clause. I can't say, and if you ask me, and you said 20% minorities own those 11,000 stations. If you ask me, the blockage is not on the FCC. It's on the black elite who owns the minority ownership. They're blocking it. Go look. They're blocking it. So my question to you is that how would you address the issue of minority ownership for women that are not part of the black elite, like myself, if I want to own a radio station? How do we get to do that if we are blocked from the top black elite?
Oh, I think that, just to be clear, I think that that's fantastic that there are any minority owners that have any sort of chain ownership. And I know that even in the 1980s, that was something that was probably the first time that you started to see that. I'm glad. I think that's wonderful. I think what I'm doing is I'm speaking for people who might be new entrants who just don't have the capital or the levers of power to get into the market. So the thing is, I'm not saying that the FCC is the only one who's responsible. I think that there are always going to be in any industry, there might be people who are blocking it from the top. So I think that there are market forces. I think that there's the FCC. I think that the truth is that we need to all be working together. And what I was saying about when we're thinking about deregulating, the public interest standard is not just an economic analysis. And I just think that we need to be aware of the fact that there are advertising dollars, I get it. Everybody's thinking about what do we do to make these stations more robust, but there are other calculations that go into that. And I think that it's important to support the local initiatives. I think that that's great that that worked out in Washington, D.C., but there are lots of cities where that's not the same story. And so that's why I'm not denying that that's a great idea. I'm just saying that we need to be aware of the fact that there are a lot of owners who may not be a part of the 90% that supported NAB's proposal. So so I'm not disagreeing with you. So maybe I'm a little bit confused about your question.
I just want to add that Kathy Hughes, she owns Urban Radio 1, which is the 9th highest earning African American business in the United States.
Okay.
So it's there.
Oh, I'm
But
not,
you see,
and
but-
just to be clear, because I feel like something that I've said has been mischaracterized, that there are no minority owners. I said that by generous calculations, of the 11,000 radio stations in the country, less than 20% are women and minorities. And that is a number that should give us pause, considering that almost 50% of the population in the United States are made up of people of color. And so I was asking, what is the FCC doing to actually support initiatives that increase the number of people of color in the industry?
But Kathy Hughes has locked up the markets, the black population in those markets. So blacks are not nationwide. They're a conglomerate in certain parts of the country. And so where they are, that's where she is.
Okay, and that's great. I would love to talk to Kathy Hughes, and Kathy Hughes would hear the same thing from me. So I come from a place in Louisiana where if I went to go and start my own radio station, there would have been very serious blockades where I lived in Louisiana. So I'm just giving you my experience, but I think that's wonderful that Kathy Hughes, that worked out.
Thank you.
I'd like to go on the record again. I've done it in the trades before. If any minority or any woman is looking to buy a radio station and they'd like any free advice, I'm more than happy to help.
That's great. I'd like to hear that. That's great. I appreciate that.
Hi. When I was a little boy, hard for me to remember back that far. But I was a newspaper boy for the Washington Evening Star, which no longer exists. And I had 125 houses on my route, which was every single house in the neighborhood. Everybody got a paper. I lived 10 blocks away from where I grew up as a little boy. I walk out the house every morning and I pick up my 3 newspapers. Nobody else on my block gets a newspaper. So I'm sorry. Newspapers, I think, are dead. They are antiques. With total respect, I think radio is in its decline and is going to die. And you said, how are they going to compete against us? I don't know the answer to that, but some of the things that occur to me are robots and drones and so on. They're going to be there, and they're going to be there cheaper and as good as radio is today. So, and I don't like government regulation, and I heard someone talk about government subsidization, and I don't want government subsidization. I don't think it works. So newspapers dead, radio dying, gonna die, Zuckerberg and company on the rise. So the question to me is, how do we prevent fascism? How do we prevent the consolidation amongst the Facebooks and the other social media outlets and being the voice that tells us how to think, what's right, what's proper, and what's improper? That's, I think, where we're headed.
I think you're partially right. When you look at the number of newspapers that have folded, but I think if you go to local communities, smaller communities, newspapers are thriving pretty well. They are the voice of record in those communities because the larger daily newspaper doesn't cover those smaller fringe communities. There are still 6,000 county or local weekly newspapers in this country and about 1,300. And there are a lot of radio stations too. So I think if you look at any individual market as a TV market, and there are 211 across this country, there are 126 on average local media entities competing in that market, 126, and that's just way too many. So when you say newspapers are dead, some are dying, some have already died, but not all of them. So what I think is happening is a thinning of the pack. We're over-mediated in a lot of markets. There are just way too many radio stations competing for a smaller and smaller piece of the pie. There have been too many newspapers. There have been too many Yellow Pages books. But if you go, startling fact, to a community of fewer than 100,000 people and ask them which they prefer when they look up a business listing, Google or the Yellow Pages book, what do you think their answer is? It's the Yellow Pages book because it provides more relevant listings. So you have to be careful saying newspapers are dead, radio's dead, et cetera, et cetera. There have been loads of people who predicted the death of newspapers and the death of radio and the death of TV. Projected out 20, 30 years, yeah, game is going to be very different, but there are quite a few that are still thriving out there and doing some pretty decent margins, and it just kind of almost depends community by community.
Regulations that are old and are past their time will kill the industry before drones will, I can assure you. We have talented, dedicated professionals who serve their community, who are vital, who are trusted, beloved, and providing tremendous local service. I'm not afraid of drones. I'm not afraid of robots. What I'm afraid of is rules that are hampering us to allow us to do our jobs.
Hear, hear.
Sorry, you had a question.
Hi, Monty Taylor, Daily. Mr. Warshaw, you, I don't know if you were here for it, but Commissioner Carr seemed to telegraph that he was leaning towards the NAB proposal for the subcab regulation, which you just said you didn't like. I know that you had asked for everything to get wiped away. If if the FCC does, as Commissioner Carr is leaning, and they do the NAB subcap proposal, is that enough to save radio, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, first off, I mean, I voted for it and I helped write it, so I definitely am for it. I just, I mean, I will take any help that we can get. I think that, from being a local broadcaster, the idea that like, having too many stations would hurt the public interest, I know better than that. But, and I think that certainly in a lot of the smaller markets, being able to own more stations would be helpful to be able to provide more local service. But I'm a proponent of the NAB proposal, and I think that it might not be perfect, but would be a tremendous improvement over what their current rules are.
You want to follow up?
Yeah, I do have a quick follow-up. I'm sorry. If they do the NAB proposal, a lot of people have expressed a worry that it will wipe out AM stations. Do you agree that that'll happen? Will you buy AM stations if the NAB subcap proposal goes into effect?
No, I would buy AM stations if there was an AM station that made sense. I wouldn't. I mean, I do think that that there may be benefits to that rule. I think people could potentially become AM specialists. They could create new formats if there were opportunities out there where they were not as sought after. And I wouldn't buy it just because it was available, but we certainly we would be open to owning more stations of either AM or FM.
I have a question about what maybe another sort of like thread in the noose of this situation, which is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically exempts internet service providers from liability for things like defamation. And it basically means you can't hold platforms responsible for that type of thing, and you can't threaten them with legal liability, whereas all the legal liability will still remain with radio, with local television news, and with the newspapers. And I've heard this from the newspaper group when there's a series of stuff going on in Congress with the antitrust trying to get news media to be able to organize for a series of years. And one of their big issues is that this liability situation needs to change. And I'm wondering if your industry feels the same.
Well, we try not to be indecent, honestly, it isn't a major issue for us. It's not a driving. That isn't one of the high priorities from our perspective.
And I think that Section 230 is a totally separate conversation, but I think that it's worth having because just also like thinking about how these online entities, these platforms are classified, I also think that's an important conversation to have as well.
The News Media Alliance, the Newspaper Association, has devoted pretty significant resources to making that case, as you may know. It's a much bigger issue for print newspapers because of their size. They still are, despite the size of any television station or radio cluster in any market, they still tend to be the largest media entity in any market, and so that's a big target for a lot of folks who want to file defamation suits.
Any additional questions? One thing we haven't focused a great deal on is, for all three of you, the recommendations that you've had or put forward, do you see them as being equally relevant in larger markets and smaller markets, or do you, in your mind, do you really see a distinction between the larger markets and the smaller markets?
Well, I'll just jump in and just say that smaller markets are much different than larger markets. There tends to be an easier go of it for smaller companies because there's less competition. So I'll be in Philadelphia tomorrow to work with a number of different companies, print, broadcast, et cetera, and there are just loads of them. And they're all looking at each other in addition to digital media. If you go to a smaller local market, it's more relaxed, not that it's a heck of a lot easier to pry dollars from advertisers' hands because they're still enamored of Facebook and Google and things like that. But it does seem to be, Jeff, I don't know how you feel about it, but in markets like Erie or other markets that aren't Philadelphia, New York, or Washington, particularly radio, seems to have a better go of it in those markets because of their control, or not control, but their voice of the community. I don't know how you feel about it either.
I think that it's a market by market basis. I think generally you have, in the smaller markets, you have more guys like me that own stations and operate them rather than big public companies. And, despite the fact that values of FM stations and AM stations have declined dramatically, still the idea that like a person is going to own a station in Philadelphia, it's pretty unusual. There was one, and he sold it. So those big companies have very often a very different strategy. They have a much larger platform and footprint. They have the national resources, national programming, networks, in some cases a big app, nationwide concert networks. So they have a kind of a different economy. I mean, I think in some ways the smaller markets have better economics. In certain ways, they're much worse. A market like New York might be 60 or 70 times the size of an Erie, but the people in the markets make twice as much money, not 60 times as much money. So it's the small fluctuations on declines have an immediate and profound impact on those markets' ability to make money and provide local service.
One thing I was thinking about, Gordon, when you said that the smaller communities are facing less competition, I was thinking about, I would think they're in many ways equally at risk of losing to digital, but what might be different is the preference of the local community, that if people are choosing to live in certain areas, they may be more tied to that and more interested in local issues than in more urban areas where people maybe are moving around more or see themselves less part of a small community and might be less interested in the local, very local issues. And that may be why they're seeing kind of a relative difference in terms of the impact of digital, which, as long as there's internet provision, should be fairly ubiquitous within the markets.
It's true. If you take a community like Jackson Hole, for instance, or any other smaller community that's on the fringe of a television market, their television station will not come to their community and do a story about their son, favorite son becoming an Eagle Scout, for instance. But the local newspaper will do it, or the local radio station might have them on. So in that sense, there's a stronger affinity for and belief that the local paper, the local radio station, local media entity of any sort, it might be a weekly paper, is more representative of them. They feel closer to it. As I tell people, if you go to my brother's bar in Philadelphia and sit down on the stool and say, that Philadelphia Inquirer, what a liberal rag that is, the guy next to you will buy you a beer. But if you go to Jackson Hole and say that Jackson Hole, and I can't remember the name of the paper, the News Bulletin is, a horrible rag, the guy next to you will punch you in the nose because he knows the reporter, he knows an ad director, he knows the publisher, and they featured his son as an Eagle Scout last year or something like that. It's just that tightness of the small local community where the bigger daily newspaper and the big TV stations just can't provide that level of coverage to those smaller communities, and there's a closer knit, I guess, to them because they're smaller communities. Everybody knows everybody.
We have radio stations, for example, in Fairfield County, which is outside, 50 miles from New York City. And if you ask the people in Fairfield County about their local radio stations, they would tell you when they've bumped into the Morning Man or when they've seen the radio station doing an event in the car park, dog park, or when they've gone into a restaurant and there was a remote broadcast going on. That's much more commonplace than in New York. Even though they're very close geographically, in many ways, local radio has a different meaning to people in a town of 100,000, 200,000 than it does to 10 million.
And probably also a very different meaning to people who are 40 plus versus 15. I know my children don't, I think, know what radio is.
I think that generally for 15-year-olds, it's not a high passion area, no matter where you are. Not yet, at least until they start working.
Sorry. Francella, you were about to say something and I stopped you.
The only thing I was going to say, the way that I think about it is I work a lot on digital access issues. And so I think a lot when I'm in Louisiana, if I'm in a place that I don't have internet access, I'm more likely to actually put on the radio or put it on my car or when I'm at home, as opposed to if I'm in a place like DC where I can get a signal anywhere. So that's what would be the difference for me.
Then that would actually well, if one thinks that the ownership rules are capping and harming the provision of local news and services, then that would be an argument that the areas that have more difficulty in in broadband provision would be the areas that really need the removal of the restrictions the most.
That's completely possible, and I think that that's one way of having a tailored solution rather than just saying in general we should deregulate, because for me the standard for deregulating should always be not just is it not going to harm the public, but does it actually advance the public's interest?
All right. One last question?
It was kind of linked to my thoughts about how traditional media and digital media sort of, for lack of a better word, more or less converging as far as dollars spent. And as it relates to your comment, how can you close the gap when there are certain areas that don't really have the infrastructure that would allow local media to have a playing field to begin with? And how does that play into broader strategies or policies that are related to investment in certain communities? Because you mentioned, as is true, certain areas don't even have coverage. So, even if, let's say, traditional media is also become more competitive on a regional basis by having a strong digital component of original content or whatnot, it still sort of wouldn't reach everyone who it needs to reach.
I agree with you there. And one thing that goes back to one of my earlier comments, that we need to come up with a better supply of ideas, because the truth is that we're not going to come up with all of them here in Washington, D.C. I come from a place where when I go home, people ask me how I'm doing, and then they actually wait to hear the answer. And it's a totally different dynamic than here in Washington, D.C., where it's very transactional. And when you go home, people are waiting, they're listening, they're interacting. I think it's just a totally different place. And I think that we need to be able to get ideas from places like that really are interacting with their local radio staff or interacting with their TV broadcasters. I think it's totally different than the solutions we'd come up with here in DC. However, I don't think we need a patchwork of solutions across the country, but I do think we need to have some sort of carve-outs for markets that are just different.
Well, thank the panel. I want to thank the panel and the Federalist Society again for this very interesting discussion of an issue that I would hope would just go away in a good way.